He'll be followed by Sam Gindin, who, along with Leo Panich, just wrote The Making of Global Capitalism, former assistant to the president of the Canadian Auto Workers, and with the Greater Toronto Workers Assembly.
I want to get to the same question of a universal public plan. I did want to just, I was going to save it maybe for the questions, but I did want to comment very quickly on Doug's point about financial markets and what they do. He's quite right about the fact that contrary to what a lot of the left has been talking about in terms of profits not being high enough, and there's a crisis in terms of profits. Profits have been high and they've been able to fund investment. But there's other roles for finance that, that make finance very important. One is that even if the stock market is only reallocating funds rather than creating new funds, the reallocation of capital is fundamental to capitalism. This is how the system works, by constantly reallocating and restructuring. So that's crucial. Finance plays a very important role in mergers. It plays a very important role in new firms. So in terms of size, this may not be so large, but it's critical to the operation of capitalism. Finance plays a role in helping firms manage their risks through derivatives. And if you couldn't manage those risks, the ability to have a global capitalism would really be weakened. If you're going to go abroad and take the risks of exchange rates, of inflation rates, of interest rates, of other political uncertainties, you have to have some way of managing those risks. And that's partly what finance does. And finance plays a very important imperial role. Because the U.S. can attract finance to the extent that it can from global savings, it means that the U.S. can play a particular role in managing the system. Maybe we can get into that. That wasn't something I was going to talk about. I just want to throw that in. I really want to start with where Doug ended, about the problems of trying to fix all kinds of issues in capitalism by putting the load on pensions and reforms in the existing pension scheme we have. And the problem is, and Kevin's really been trying to emphasize this throughout the seminar, is that what you risk is the problem of co-optation, of just being integrated into the financial calculus. There's the danger of diversion, that you think that you can solve these big problems of equity or the environment through the pension system, and therefore you don't cope with the question of how do you deal with them. And the fact that they can actually be used against us, as Doug said, in terms of the use of pension funds in privatizations and P3s. Now, the more general problem is that workers in capitalism always have a contradictory existence. On the one hand, in the private sector, you're opposing your employer. On the other hand, you depend on your employer for your job, the most important thing you have in terms of getting access to income. And in the public sector, it's the same issue. The issue of the welfare state has always been linked to the need for growth, and growth depends on growth in the private sector. The issue of the public sector actually leading the private sector becomes problematic, because if the private sector is the key to growth, you can't have the public sector setting standards. And in fact, what happens is you isolate the public sector using the fact that the public sector is paid for through other workers, the taxes and other workers' wages. Now, those kinds of contradictions are aggravated by the fact that workers aren't just workers, they're actually savers and creditors. And the role of workers as savers and creditors really grew right after the First World War, Second World War. It really accelerated in terms of mortgages and pensions. And with neoliberalism, it was really deepened, because with neoliberalism, you're not just a saver and a creditor, you're also a debtor. You're also an investor. With neoliberalism, the pressure on wages mean that you're more concerned with what kind of returns are you getting on your assets, whether that's a pension fund or your home. And the opportunities of financial markets mean that there's pressure to start thinking like financiers, thinking in terms of calculating everything. So this really aggravates these kinds of contradictions. Now, when we look at the history of private pensions, one of the important things is that they were initiated by employers. I mean, the question is, why do you need a pension? Just give us a good wage, and we'll save, and that's what we'll do for retirement. They are initiated by employers because they reduce the flexibility of workers. They tied workers to the company. They had tighter vesting rules. Portability was limited. So they are really initiated by employers. I think to some extent, workers look to them, partly because of the difficulties in actually winning a public plan, although they could still save, but also because of the argument that as an individual saver, you would get a low rate of return. If you pooled it through a large company, you would be able to get a higher rate of return. But with mutual funds, that argument kind of disappears. You can pool your savings, even as an individual, in a mutual fund, and it's not obvious why you would need a private pension. But what really undermined the private pension plans as they developed historically is that they were a private welfare state. And capitalism couldn't sustain a private welfare state. It was fine as long as capitalism was growing. And when you look from 1890 to 1970, you look at the largest firms in the country, they're basically the same. After 1970, and especially in the 80s and 90s, this really changes. There's a massive restructuring. Companies start to actually fail. And if companies are failing, then you can't guarantee the pension plan. So competition, and neoliberal competition, as competition was deepened, really undermined the private welfare state and private pensions. Now, the significance of that is that as soon as you're undermining private pensions, you're also undermining public pensions. I'm not talking about the universal plan, but public pensions in terms of teachers and municipal workers. There is no way that we can expect public pensions to be maintained if the private sector is either losing its pensions or seeing them worsened, significantly worsened, in terms of both benefits and their structure. The pressure on the public sector will keep intensifying in terms of also weakening public pressure. So this is very dangerous. Public sector pensions are as vulnerable as those of workers in the private sector facing competition. Now, the argument for a universal public plan starts with that very danger that the private plans are failing, and therefore pensions are only going to remain in parts of the public sector. But it's primarily about the question of equity. The real inequality within the working class isn't in wages, it's actually in pensions. It's because so many people are excluded from the CPP because they don't have a steady income, or their income is marginal if they're single mothers. And the pension plans just exaggerate the inequalities that are in the labor market already. If your income is higher, you're going to get a higher pension. So any notion of changing this would have to be concerned very much with equity and a floor. A more important point is the point that Doug raised, and that is this question of actually building class power. One of the barriers to building class power is that great inequality in pensions that isolate certain sections of the working class from each other. If we're really going to build the working class so we can take on issues, we have to examine everything that we do from the perspective of how is it building the class? How is it building class solidarity? And a universal pension plan is an incredible opportunity to actually address that. You'd have to do that by mobilizing other workers and by developing a plan that really did have a measure of equality in it that overcame things like the resentment against the teachers that we just saw in their own strike, and the fact that even in the private sector now, you're starting to move towards two-tier sectors. You're getting inequality in the same workplaces around the pension issue, because wages, as wages move to two tiers, pensions are even getting worse in terms of the gap, and the new workers not even having a defined benefit plan, but moving towards defined contribution. The third reason for looking at a universal plan, and in some ways I think the most important, but also the most problematic, and the one that I think needs the most discussion, is this a way of actually challenging finance? Is this just another social welfare program? Are we just talking about expanding quite dramatically the Canada Pension Plan? When I say expanding it, I mean starting to talk about levels like 70% of average income as a pension goal. But is it also a way of challenging finance? Is there any way that a universal plan, I'm not talking about private plans and their limits, but that a public plan could be used so that we're mobilizing worker savings for their own purposes, so that we're actually putting something on the agenda that has us going on the defensive again? So I want to say something about just...
Offensive, Sam.
Oh,
We want to be on the offensive for change.
It's hard for me to say offensive, I've just been on the defensive for so long. I want to say a few things just about the question of technical possibilities, and then I want to get really into some of the politics and other dimensions of this. In terms of the possibilities of this, the head actuary of the Canada Pension Plan a couple of years ago actually looked at the possibility of having a pension plan that paid 70% of pensions. It's complicated because you have to decide at what age people can retire. He was looking at people retiring basically at age 65 and what you would do about the floor. But he concluded it was very possible with a small increase in taxation. And I should say that in terms of the increases in costs, this puts on the question at the same time restructuring the tax system so that you actually tax the wealthy in a way they used to be taxed in both Canada and the United States. But there's no way of getting around this without having to tax workers. Workers would have to be taxed. The second thing is right now Canada pays less into its pension system, its public pension system, far less than not just Europe, but even less than the United States, significantly less than the United States. That the technical question isn't the main question. It's always a question of how important is this program. It's a choice to be made about our living standards and our priorities and what we're ready to pay for it. But one of the things we would definitely, there are two things that seem to be worth thinking about. If you're in the private sector and you're seeing your private plan disappear, you're worried about it because it's becoming vulnerable. One of the questions is, why not try to negotiate that plan is actually put into the public CPP? This is something that Sean Smith raised. The question is, the money is there, especially in defined contribution plans. Why not say we don't trust this? We don't trust our private company. It's not just a question of trusting them. The market might destroy them. Why don't we want to guarantee that those funds be transferred and somehow integrated into the Canada Pension Plan? It raises complex questions about the Canada Pension Plan, but it does put something on the agenda in the private sector that's worth thinking about. In the public sector, and looking at teachers, for example, you have to deal with the question of some kind of transition, just politically. It's very difficult to imagine that you could go to teachers and say, forget about your pension plan. We want you to just think about a public plan. But what is possible to think about is that young teachers may not have this pension plan in the future. They certainly won't have this kind of a pension plan. And if what continues to happen, and it started with freezing COLA for teachers' pensions, if teachers' pension plans stop falling, so they're not 70% of the level, if simultaneously you've got a growth in the public plan over time, you can develop quite an interesting transition where what the teachers lose over time in their existing plan is made up in a public universal plan, and you can begin to imagine having some solidarity with teachers. It would take an enormous amount of education, but I think it's possible. There's other questions that I think have to be raised. One is, if we're starting to think about pensions, and pensions, we're not talking about something small. We're talking about something quite massive in terms of financial markets. If we're talking about pensions becoming a form of redistribution, of collecting worker savings and using them for a specific purpose, do we also want to think about that in terms of extending it to other sectors? Why not mortgages? Why not public housing? Why not think more broadly about mobilizing worker sectors and think in terms of trying to carve out the retail sector so that workers' savings are used in a social way? It's almost like trying to think of a co-op, but instead of a co-op that's marginal, you're actually thinking about this on a large scale and by way of the state. It still means that you've got an economy that's still operating within capitalism. There still is the productive economy that's going to grow, that's going to need financial markets for its own purposes. But the question is, when we're thinking about a universal pension plan and we're thinking about how this might affect the question of savings and finance, can we think about it in a larger way that begins to put a border around worker savings and use them in a particular way? And that raises a number of questions. One is how this would relate to the banks. Can you even think about this without thinking about nationalizing the banks and taking them over and using them in a different way? Or is this a way of strangling the banks if you can get away with it because you're taking out a major part of what funded them? The other is that if you do this, you're accepting the fact that you're not going to get a maximum return on your pension fund. That it's going to cost more in that sense, that this isn't what you want to do. And it means that there has to be a cultural change in what we consider important. And if we don't do that, then this becomes, it runs into problems that I think would really be a barrier. It means that you actually have to think about, why are SUVs more important than nursing homes? You have to think about the balance between public consumption and private consumption. It raises all kinds of questions about the environment, obviously. And those are the kinds of things that have to be thought about. And you also have to think about the fact that if we are expanding this way, it's an unstable situation. You're trying to do something within capitalism that we have to think about is constantly going to be attacked and potentially undermined. And we have to think about, do we see this as a stage in some kind of a socialist strategy, where in this stage, the most we can imagine in terms of developing power to do is to get some control over these savings and use them in a more social way. Is it a stage from which we can imagine going further in terms of trying to develop development banks, different kinds of banks that could actually begin to look at the productive economy? But we have to be conscious of the fact that this is going to be constantly under attack and under threat of being undermined, and that raises the main question of politics. So I just want to summarize by just emphasizing these points. One is, if we're going to try to go in this radical direction, it has to be accompanied by a change in our culture, a change in our vision of what we want in society. It has to be seen as a strategy that's actually building the working class, and that solidarity is fundamental to it. It has to be seen as a strategy that's really focused on attacking finance and trying to figure out how we cope with this question of finance. Because if we can't cope with the question of finance, finance will always discipline us. It will undermine whatever we do unless we take on finance. Otherwise, we're kidding ourselves. And then we have to think about, if we're thinking about how to build this, the question is, what are some of the concrete things we can do? The Labour Committee of the Assembly has decided to take this on as a particular project. If we want to start organizing around it, we want to start getting together people who understand this a lot better than I do, and get them to do the technical work so we can develop a plan. We've talked to the Center for Social Justice about maybe in a year from now coming back and actually trying to put forth a specific proposal around this. We want to think about whether we can get workers, young teachers, workers in the public sector, workers in the private sector, to start thinking about not just sitting around worrying about this, but what they can actually do in organizing in the workplace. I just want to conclude with this, with the CLC. The CLC, to their credit, a few years ago, I think it was in 2009, had pressure on it to do something about the pension thing. I mean, private sector workers were really freaking out about what was happening to their pensions. Polls are terrific on this. If you poll retirees who are guaranteed their pension, you ask them what they think of moving towards a universal plan that might increase taxes, you actually get quite a good response. The CLC saw this opening. It was also at a moment when the CLC was under pressure to start representing a more general interest, so it's not as isolated. So the CLC saw the politics of actually doing this. But the CLC isn't capable of doing this. I just think we have to frankly recognize that. The CLC isn't capable because it's lost its capacity to mobilize. And when it mobilizes, it seizes it as spin, and it's immediately looking for a solution. So, just a quick negotiated solution. So as soon as Flaherty says, okay, we'll do something about it, they back off, and they're actually relieved that they don't have to do much about it. And Flaherty actually was thinking about doing something about it because he was, of course, thinking, we'll mobilize all these savings and we'll give them to the finance, and finance will love it too. What's the problem? Right now, they're not even going to do that. So we just have to recognize the CLC is not, no one's going to do this for us unless we can develop the kind of a left that has a foot inside the labor movement and that can get working people to start saying, we want to do this. Nothing is going to happen. It's not going to happen like, through the NDP, and it's not going to happen through the CLC. Okay, thank you.